Are you as sick as I am of the bullcrap that we're fed by the modern AAA games industry? Are you tired of piecemeal games that require endless updates, DLCs, and microtransactions to get the complete experience? Are you tired of games that hold your hand from start to finish, always telling you where to go and what to do? Are you tired of games where the characters aren't named after food for some reason? The Dusty Game Society is. That's why we scour the annals of gaming history to find the best old games to satisfy our dusty desires. It's our job to dig through the dirt, find the treasures, and share them with you. Aren't you lucky? Yeah, you are. I'll tell you more about the Dusty Game Society at the end of the video, but first, we have a game to share. A true hidden gem, an unsung hero of the JRPG genre, a classic title from the library of the original Game Boy. So grab your fork, you'll see why in a minute, and enjoy the soothing title screen music of Great Greed. Great Greed is an interesting game, to say the least. Not interesting like you, interesting in a good way. It's a traditional JRPG from the early days of portable gaming, but it's also a setting and a story that is completely different, not only from everything else at the time, it's still very different from most stuff that's been around since then, including the stuff today. I can guarantee you've never played a game quite like Great Greed. And that alone makes this a super interesting game to play with the Dusty Game Society last month, because all of us were just like, what even is happening? We were in the deep end together, and it was a heck of a ride. This game came out in 1993 in North America, but in 1992 in Japan, and there it was called Vitaminia Kingdom Story. And if you're thinking Vitaminia, like vitamins, like the food vitamins, yeah. It's a game of many different themes, which we'll talk about, but let's start with the box art. You got this buff hero guy with a sword fighting a rock monster, spitting rock shards, done in a classic fantasy mixed media airbrush and pencil crayon style. I love fantasy art from the 80s and 90s, and this art is just so great at setting the mood for the game. The manual, which is actually amazing, and we'll talk more about it in a bit. At the start of the manual, there is a little introduction to set the scene. This is not one of those long ago, once upon a time foo-foo role-playing games. This is a tale that begins in a forest somewhere in our world today. You, the hero, are checking the acid rain levels with your buddy when, boom, out of nowhere pops a strange old bag who calls herself Microwave. She's attacked by a psycho mutant dude called the Hunter, and before you know it, you're being sucked into some kind of vortex. And you thought you hated Mondays. Jeez, man, that was heavy-handed. Kind of a weird tone to take in the manual, considering that's not really the tone of the game, but whatever. So the overall vibe of this game is simple, but it's not simple to describe because you'll hear it and it'll make no sense. It is a story with themes of environmental conservation, but also food. Everything is named after food. Even most of the monsters and enemies and the locations and towns. It's such a weird thing, and it's fun. That aspect alone had me chuckling a few times, and I know lots of the other dweebs of the DGS felt the same way. As I was playing this, I kept showing my mom all the weird names. Hey mom, look, I'm fighting a hot dog named Wiener. And it only gets weirder the deeper you go. And I freaking love it. But there's this weird contrast because so much of it is silly, but also the themes and the story beats can be pretty heavy. There's like lots of environmental stuff and corporate corruption stuff. You make friends and help them and they help you, and there's some meaningful story twists that were genuinely touching. I found I actually cared about lots of these little sprites. And the story isn't just there to pull you from town to town. There are things in this world that require you to interact with, to think about how to solve and make decisions. I'll give you one example. There's this town where the laws change all the time and you have to follow the laws. But you find out that you can pay to change the laws yourself. And if you don't follow the rules, you're thrown in jail. But at one point you need to get into the jail because someone is in there that you need to talk to. So you got to break the law on purpose and get thrown in jail. There's lots of these small little scenarios that genuinely pulled me in, and I wanted to see them through and solve the mystery or help whoever needed helping or whatever. It's not like the best is best story writing that you've ever heard or anything, but for a 1992 Game Boy game, it's surprisingly deep and entertaining. This is the kind of game where you need to pay attention to. One of those old school games. You know the ones. Because there are times that an NPC will tell you exactly where you need to go, but they'll only say it once. So if you miss it, you'll be stuck and you'll have to resort to searching up a walkthrough like a failure. Luckily, the game manual actually has some great info if you get stuck. They kind of give you the broad strokes of where you need to go for each chapter. So I highly recommend reading the manual, and not just if you get stuck, just read it. There's a ton of useful info in there that'll get you off on the right foot. Looking at the manual as I wrote this review, I really wish that I read it properly before I started the game, because it would have been super helpful to know this stuff right off the start. Especially the tip about the last boss. I had to learn that the hard way. The gameplay is pretty standard early retro JRPG stuff. You'll be wandering around and getting into random battles, and you have an attack and dodge and run action bound to A and B and start. However, there is a time limit. You only have a few seconds to choose what to do, so it adds a bit to the tension. There's also magic in the game in the form of scrolls, and you can bind scrolls to the directions on the D-pad to use during battle. Those use your magic points, which is a resource that you'll have to manage. Between fights, you can access your inventory to use consumables to refill your HP and your MP. There are two main spells you'll use pretty much the whole game. You got heal, which heals you mid-battle, and then power you'll get later, which is like an attack buff, and that becomes important for the bosses. You'll get new and higher level spells by buying them from the magic shop in the villages. Same thing with your gear. You have armor and a weapon that can be upgraded as you progress. The gameplay is pretty easy, especially if you're like me and don't mind grinding out a few levels every now and then just to stay ahead of the curve. I won't admit to using fast forward to speed up the grinding though. I would never admit that. You can't make me. However, near the end of the game, there is a pretty big difficulty spike, and the final area is just a freaking slog with tons of random encounters and very few opportunities to rest and refill. Graphically, the game is what I'd call simple but charming. There's not a lot of detail to anything, but what's here is nice. Really solid pixel work on the sprites that makes them feel unique from each other despite being tiny. And the environments have decent looking tiles, and it all comes together to feel like a believable video game world. The art for the monsters is the star of the show. These guys are just bonkers. Most of them are food themed, some of them are cute and quirky, some of them feel like fantasy people, and some of them are just nuts and make no sense. After you beat the game, you gain access to a bestiary, and I really enjoyed looking through all the monsters and gawking at the awesome pixel art. The sound is a mixed bag. I love the theme music in the main menu. It's this kind of sad melody that feels like you hear it echoing around the walls of a medieval court. Lots of the in-game music is pretty good, however, the problem is that it gets repetitive after a while. I mean, you'll be playing this for many hours. There's only so many times you can hear the overworld tune before you're ready to never hear it again for the rest of your life. And there's not much for sound effects either. Some satisfying feedback sounds for combat, but it's not much. It's just kind of there. So, Great Greed. It's so good that I feel like it's weird that everyone doesn't already know about this game and talk about it all the time. Maybe you're watching this and you know about it, but I'm pretty sure there's a good chance that you are just hearing about it for the first time in this video. Most of the dusty dweebs of the DGS hadn't heard about it before we started last month. And it's also a great early example of an RPG for the Game Boy. And it's so fun and weird and quirky that it's probably more memorable than most of them. Now, it's not going to be for everyone, obviously. If you don't like JRPGs, or you don't have patience for grinding or paying attention when NPCs tell you things, then you're not going to have fun. This feels like the kind of game that young TechDweeb would buy because of the box art and then bail after 10 minutes because there was too much reading and numbers. But I sure did have fun as a growed-up TechDweeb. I love finding games like this. Digging up these lesser-known games from the dusty archives of gaming history is one of my favorite things, and sharing the experience with a bunch of other cool dweebs is the icing on the eye cake. Yeah, eye cake. That's a thing. Speaking of which, the Dusty Game Society isn't a one dweeb show. I'm just the flapping hands acting as the glue that holds it all together. So let's hear from the other DGS members about what they think about Great Greed, shall we? Kamimoto125 says, "This game was a trip. loves the blunt humor, didn't like that it sometimes felt like a slog, had a good time except for the last dungeon, but overall liked the game, gave it 8 out of 10, and felt like it was a great start to the DGS 2025 season. Heck yeah, buddy. Next up, we have a review by Walker TX Ranger, which I assume is Walker Texas Ranger, which is a show from the 90s starring Chuck Norris. And I gotta say this because I was delighted when I found this out. That show was released literally at the same time as this game, April 1993. That is fate right there. Walker had a blast with the game. Not usually a fan of JRPGs, but really enjoyed this one. Liked the quirky character names and funny dialogue, found the game straightforward and approachable, manageable fighting with just enough depth, and overall had a great time playing their first DGS game and enjoyed hanging out and chatting about the game all month long and gave it a 9 out of 10. Copyman666 is another new member of the DGS and loved Great Greed. Liked the systems and the gameplay, found it a little bit grindy but was won over by the stupid food names. Mark Dell says it was a thrilling journey. Fast forward was a game changer, especially because he had to replay a good chunk of the game because he lost it because of a save game thing. This game replaced Mystic Quest as his favorite Game Boy RPG. It stole his heart. Rixba found the built-in save system was quite generous, but overall didn't love the game. Found the mechanics, leveling, and loot to be pretty unremarkable, but appreciated that the game didn't feel padded out, and thought that the message about corporate greed and its effect on society and the environment was still relevant today. 6 out of 10. Bits and Bytes says, what a treat. They love RPGs and had a blast with this one. Loved how easy it was to get into, but deep enough to have lots of fun. Loved the enemy designs and variety and sprite artwork. Found the game progress was well balanced and just the right amount of story and hints to figure out where to go and what to do. Loved the oddball ending and the fun dialogue, and appreciated playing it with the DGS, otherwise they never would have discovered it. Krills Wilson didn't like it, found it to be a chore and eventually bailed, but did like some of the stuff like the humor and the art. Ultimately just wasn't having much fun, and maybe JRPGs just aren't for them. Gave it 3 out of 10 princesses calling dead guards lame. Which is a thing that happens early in the game. Your castle is attacked and you walk up to a dying guard and the princess just says, lame. We all got a good chuckle out of that. Sir Andrew loved Great Greed. Found it was a blast from the past coming back to a game with random encounters. Liked the cheeky names and that the game didn't require handholding. Some tricky spots that were a challenge didn't overshadow the classic gameplay that is simple and satisfying and way ahead of its time. With some fun jokes in there, especially with the loot in the wasteland, which I got a kick out of too. 10 out of 10 peppers. Blade Crush loved the food-themed names and charming world. Found some of the random encounter mechanics frustrating, but overall had lots of fun. Antimatter found it to be a fun and lightweight RPG built for playing on the go. Appreciated the modern touches despite it being a retro RPG through and through. Liked that there was a bit of grinding, a bit of humor, and the themes and the message give it a fun atmosphere that hits right. The Shibushi says, this game can be summed up in one word, simplistic, which is both a blessing and a curse. It's simple in good ways like being approachable and only having one character with a straightforward story, which means that you don't have to worry about much, and ultimately felt like it's the game's true strength. It's not a 100-hour RPG that overstays its welcome. There are times when it's too simple and it feels repetitive and mundane, but still found it to be a fun game that scratches that RPG itch. Oh, and they say it's a bite-sized RPG. That's a good pun. I had to include that. I loved playing Great Greed, probably my favorite month for the DGS yet, although I'm having a great time this month too. And that's the best part of the DGS. Hanging out and chatting about a game that we're all playing really feels like a book club full of retro game nerds, playing games that are fun instead of reading boring books. The DGS is a perk that I offer to my patrons. If you would like to support my work and become a patron and get access to the DGS, there's some info and a link in the description below. And if you don't want to throw money at a Canadian stranger on the internet, that's all good. That's why I make the video each month, to inspire you to give these games a try on your own. So play some Great Greed and let us know what you think. Feel free to talk about everything great and greedy in the comments below. And while you're down there, click the thumbs up button if you liked the video, or don't if you didn't. From me and everyone at the DGS, stay dusty, my friends.